For almost a year, I've been living in Australia on a working holiday visa. In October 2022, I left Vancouver, went to Montreal, then Greece, spent a day in Singapore, and finally ended up here. I left everything I knew behind to travel to new places, meet new people, and try to gain a better understanding of the world that we live in. My time in Australia has had just as many big moments as small ones, and it's the small ones that will never be captured. When I take these trips on my own, in some ways it all seems so much slower. You don't have anyone to bounce your excitement or ideas off of, so even the awe-inspiring moments don't feel as shareable. So many of my amazing memories here are from the people I've met and the sporadic moments that are never caught on film. So figuring out what to do with this video was a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to approach this video a little differently. I'm going to have one main video that is mostly about the traveling and philosophical aspects of my time here. And I'll make some separate supplementary videos that dive a bit deeper into the hikes and activities I've participated in. So come on this journey with me in the Great Down Under, as I reminisce about kangaroos, waterfalls, and a total disrespect for the letter R. I spent my first month in Australia living just north of Sydney with my aunt and uncle Keith and Doll. Well, second cousin once removed and his wife. They have a beautiful home with a spectacular view of a lagoon from the balcony, which gets a lot of avian visitors. They live in an area called the Northern Beaches, picturesque suburbs that are about 30 minutes north of Sydney, with world-famous surfing, massive white sand beaches, and an insane number of cockatoos. It's home to a whole host of tropical animals, including water dragons and thousands of flying fox bats. It truly is a subtropical paradise, and I can't thank Keith and Doll enough for letting me stick around for as long as I did. I also visited my second cousin, their daughter, where she lives just south of Sydney, in a town called Wollongong. She's built a pond in her backyard that has attracted some very entertaining polyrhythmic frogs. And, of course, a tourist can't go to Sydney without visiting the Blue Mountains, although it's really more of a canyon. The area earned its name from the high concentration of eucalyptus oil in the air from the trees, which increases the light's natural scattering effect and makes everything appear slightly more blue. I only stayed there one night at a hostel, since my ankle was still recovering from the accident, and many of the hiking trails were closed due to recent flooding. When I first arrived in Australia, my original plan was to head north to the tropics, but on the very strong recommendation of many people to not go there during the summer, I decided to head down to Melbourne first, and I'm really glad I did. Despite me generally not liking big cities, Melbourne captured my heart. I met some great people, hung out with an old friend I hadn't seen in 20 years, and even finally realized my dream of doing stand-up comedy.
The problem was that this was an advertisement for a Father's Day sale?
Oh no!
After being in Melbourne for a few months, in March of 2023, my cousin, who lives in Wollongong, decided to sell me her Honda Jazz for dirt cheap. So I flew back to Sydney and did a 5-day drive back to Melbourne, and saw some more of the country, sleeping in the car on the way. I spent a couple days heading south along the coast, and got to see the many beautiful beaches and rainforests of Australia's southeast coast. While I was on this road trip, I visited the Historical Aircraft Restoration Society's Aviation Museum, run entirely by volunteers, including mechanics who keep many of the planes in flyable condition. After a couple days of driving along the coast, I turned inland and drove 20 kilometers down a back road to find a campsite tucked away in the New South Wales rainforest. This was when I really fell in love with the jazz, especially after the river crossing. Heading further inland took me into the highlands into what are known as the Snowy Mountains, which includes Mount Kosciuszko, the highest mountain in Australia. This was where I did my first proper hike since my accident, and will be my first supplementary video to this one. The drive down from Kosciuszko was stunning, with the sun cascading through the rainforest canopy and the superb views from the highway. The winding roads were also tons of fun in the Jazz, since it handles like a little go-kart. The last night on the road before returning to Melbourne, I slept beside a serene river that borders New South Wales and Victoria. I really don't have much else to say about my time in Melbourne. It's one of those episodes of my life that I couldn't in a million years accurately represent the impacts it had on me. I lived in a few different places, met some remarkable people, made some awesome memories, and saw my first live kangaroos. I specify live because when driving through regional Australia, you will see an astonishing number of dead ones. And so, after my 5 months in Melbourne, it was with much trepidation that I started my journey northward. As much as I wanted to stay, I knew that if I spent the entire year in one city, I wouldn't forgive myself. So I drove back to Sydney and spent some time there preparing for the next leg of my journey to Cairns, in far north Queensland. While in Sydney, my close friend Ed flew down to Australia to visit me, which will be the topic of the second supplemental video. I left Sydney on June 10th, 2 days before the anniversary of my accident. Over the previous months, I had been exercising and hiking a lot to prepare my ankle for this occasion. The plan was to go backpacking in celebration of my recovery so far. It was a huge success, and will be the topic of the third supplemental video. To be honest, for the first week or so after leaving Sydney, I was feeling really down. Depressed might not be the right word, but I was genuinely struggling to enjoy myself. I even found a lighthouse overlooking a fantastic beach, and saw whales swimming north under a rainbow. If I asked you to list 3 things that make people happy, I'm sure whales and rainbows would be 2 of them. Yet, somehow, it didn't help. I believe it was a combination of factors, like how it was the winter time and the sun was going down at 5 p.m. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to see and do anything while it was up, and ended up spending a lot of daylight figuring out where I was going to stay for the night. I was also lonely. Sure, I had stayed with my aunt and uncle for the previous month, but I hadn't spent too much time with people my age, other than when I was doing comedy. This was especially difficult since I had left a really fun share house in Melbourne in exchange for this lifestyle. Even though I knew in my head the loneliness was part of why I was doing this, part of the human experience that adds to my overall understanding of life, it still just kinda sucked. As I continued north, I spent a couple days at Springbrook National Park, a place abound with spectacular waterfalls, some of which you can actually walk behind, something I've actually always wanted to do. Unfortunately, the video games lied to me, and there was no treasure back there. But I digress. The fourth supplemental video will be a collection of the various hikes I did in my journey from Sydney to Cairns. From Springbrook, I spent a few days staying at a hostel in Gold Coast, where I did some comedy and hung out with a couple guys. After 4 days of being around people, I was reset and ready to be alone again. I spent the next 2 weeks essentially on my own, camping at roadside stops and doing some touristy things. Happily, I was enjoying myself much, much more. In the wake of several months spent along the coastal shores, I felt the pull to venture inland. This journey eventually led me to the edge of the outback, where I embarked on a 3-day odyssey, tracing unswerving paths through sweltering and unending plains in a region effectively known as the Gabba, the Great Australian Bugger All. Here, I found myself navigating hours of solitude, traversing a landscape bereft of companionship. I found myself intrigued by the profound emptiness. More time alone, an opportunity to embrace solitude, to ruminate on ideas, to meditate amidst the relentless, undulating road that stretches toward a minuscule speck on the distant horizon. So I stared at that distant point, where the two parallel lines converge to meet the sky. It's a place I'm constantly chasing, but can never reach. No matter how fast I go, or how hard I struggle, I just can't get there. I see others pass through it, yet it continues to elude me. This, according to Buddhists, is why the pursuit of happiness is so dangerous. Happiness will never be attained if it is your sole focus. Happiness does not create happiness. It is the product of mixing compassion, suffering, and success in a beaker. Perpetual bliss is an unattainable state for humanity. It's the human condition to be constantly, slightly dissatisfied with what we have. It's why we left Africa, why we built boats and spaceships and big screen TVs. The grass is always greener on the other side. But it seems that if we spend more time tending to the health of our own pasture, that might not always be the case. Eventually, my route took me through a region known as the Gemfields. This area has one of the highest concentrations of precious stones in the world. I took a tour of an old mine that had been outfitted for tourism. Unfortunately, they did not allow people to film down there, but I did get some footage of the microbats. It was interesting hearing about modern-day miners behaving like you hear about in the gold rush days of the west coast of North America. Drop their job, move to a place said to have valuable gems, stake a claim, and just get dirty. It struck me as such a pure way of earning a living. And many of the people living in the area do quite well for themselves, mining 6 months a year and traveling the other 6. My last night before getting into Cairns, I camped on the side of a river, where I was absolutely destroyed by bugs. I forgot that the tropics are synonymous with insects. I made the mistake of leaving my windows cracked, and so many mosquitoes flew inside I could hear all of them flying around inside the car. Before arriving in Cairns the next day, I was driving along the coast and looked out to sea and saw dozens of small islands dotting the horizon. That's when I remembered one of the main reasons why I wanted to come to Australia in the first place: the Great Barrier Reef. My previous weeks on the road, in Sydney, and even back to my time in Melbourne, I was having such a variety of experiences, I somehow forgot about the Great Barrier Reef. The fifth and final supplementary video will be from my few trips snorkeling out on the reef. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to afford to learn to dive, but that's okay. The snorkeling was still pretty wild. As my time in Australia comes to a close, I've been thinking a lot about the past year and the impact it has had on me. I tried to avoid using the verbiage of looking for something, finding myself, finding my purpose, blah blah blah. So what is my motivation? Why did I fly to the other side of the world? The truth is, it almost feels like I'm running from something. I started my career 4 days after finishing university. I didn't really get the chance to do anything really wild and different. I recognize that many people would love to be in that situation. But as a human that lives on this planet, I felt some sort of obligation to go somewhere, anywhere else, to get a sense of what it's like to live in a different place. So maybe I'm not running away. Maybe I'm taking a step back. Instead of a big red eject button, it's a small black reset button. One that most people don't ever feel the need to press. I spend a lot of time in my videos talking about Type 2 fun. Things that suck in the moment that are viewed positively in the future. Delayed gratification for a greater overall reward at the end. I also spend a lot of time hinting at my fear of becoming domesticated. The 9 to 5, the pension, the same company for decades that owns the majority of your life and decides where you can go and when until you retire. It sends chills up my spine just saying it. But perhaps that is the ultimate Type 2 fun. I haven't really had a lot of money while I've been in Australia. And while I have had the grand experiences that I've talked about throughout this video, the truth is, a lot of it was just hanging out and trying to save money. When I was working back in Canada before I left, I was way more active and had way more adventures than ever before. I bought the vehicle that I wanted, could afford a comfortable place, had lots of time to hang out with friends. It's true, I felt trapped at that job, and it often felt like it just dragged on and took up too much of my life. But when I wasn't working, I was living so much more of the life that I wanted to. So here I am, looking back fondly on those times. Type 2 fun. The next leg of my journey will take me to New Zealand. Although I must admit, I think I'm starting to feel ready to go home.